Hello everyone, welcome to the CN webinar in partnership with Q-Flow. I'm Construction News Deputy Editor Ben Vogel, and today I'm joined by a panel of experts to discuss how the construction sector is delivering on the issue of product traceability. 7 years on from Dame Judith Hackitt's landmark report, Building a Safer Future. The regulatory and legislative landscape has changed since 2018, principally with the arrival of the Building Safety Act. And in this webinar, we will explore how construction is addressing the product traceability challenge, what progress has been made since the Hackitt report, and what further cultural and procedural change is needed to deliver buildings that are both compliant and trusted. We have a panel of industry experts to dig into these issues and others. They are Paul Nash, former president of the Chartered Institute of Building and a member of the BSR's Building Advisory Committee. Paul's camera's coming on. I'll wait for Paul to join by video. Meanwhile, I'll introduce the rest of the speakers. Hi, Paul. Brittany Harris is also on the panel, and she is Chief Executive Officer of Q-Flow.
Hi all.
And also we have Lauren Watts, Head of Health and Safety at Gleeds.
Morning, everyone.
Hello, and welcome to everybody. Let me remind the audience who've joined us that you can participate by asking questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom screens. I'm sure there'll be plenty. We've got plenty to talk about in the main body of the webinar, but we'll try and get around to some of your questions at the end. So I think it's a good idea to start by just going around the panel and asking the panel to summarise what the Hackitt report revealed about product traceability and its perceived inadequacies. Paul, perhaps you could start that off.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. The starting point really has to be obviously the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, and the report Building a Safer Future, which was published in May 2018. That report looked into the situation regarding products, both testing, labelling and marketing. It concluded that the regime was opaque and insufficient, and it called for a more effective regime for construction products, clearer labelling and greater product traceability as well. Now, obviously, critically also that links into the requirement for the golden thread of information, and that golden thread of information obviously is there to ensure that we can demonstrate as industry that the buildings that we are designing and constructing and managing are safe for those who use them. Products obviously have a key part to play in that. I think it's also worth saying that, and we might touch on this later on in the seminar, that obviously through the public inquiry process, we learnt a lot about the behaviours of certain product manufacturers and the way in which they had gamed the system in order to sell products. So there's a lot to talk about on this call about the state of the construction product sector, but also the lessons learned and what's being done, I think, to try and address that going forward.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. I'll throw that open also to Brittany and Lauren. Perhaps Brittany, if you could offer your perspective on that question.
Yeah, I think one of the big weaknesses that was really pulled out was this, when trying to go back and understand really what happened, why this was such a catastrophic failure. There was this real lack of traceability and lack of data that meant that it was very hard to identify who was responsible, which product specifically caused the issues, whether this was a batch or an individual item, or whether this was a sort of systemic issue. And then also really trying to get under the skin of, was this caused at the design stage? Was this caused at installation or construction? And where those weaknesses really came in. So I think there was this real honing in on the fact that that traceability bit was lacking, and ultimately that poses issues not just from a fire safety perspective, but from multiple levels within our construction industry, particularly as now we're driving towards more sustainable construction as well as safe and high quality construction, and actually having that traceability and accountability becomes incredibly important. I think the other reflection, sort of now being 7 years on from when this first came out, is that the macro sort of economic environment that the construction industry is having to operate in, as well as this change in regulatory environment, is compounding the issue. So as material price inflation goes up, the risk of those sort of last minute substitutions and value engineering becomes even higher. And so knowing that the materials that actually came onto site meet what was signed off at the design stage is becoming harder and more likely to be different. And so as we go through these various gateways, people are starting to get through gateway 2 and starting to get that sign off. The real rubber's going to hit the road when we come to gateway 3, and people have to evidence what went into this building is actually what you approved in the first instance. And I think that's going to be an increasing challenge for our industry as we go through this process further and further down the line, and as material supply chains continue to be under pressure.
Thank you very much, Brittany. And Lauren, I think I'd like to turn to you now and ask you for your perspective.
I think just to echo what Paul and Brittany have said, I think that the biggest challenge has always been the lack of the clear audit trail all the way through. I think adding on to what they said as well is historically a very weak kind of change control culture that was in place as well. So what we started out with is definitely not what we ended up with on many of our projects. And I think some of the challenge that we have working on the various projects that we do, and I've been taking the opportunity to chat to Brittany and Paul prior to doing this, and Brittany summarised it really well, is the documentation and the paperwork and the health and safety files stayed on a shelf somewhere, and you blew the dust off them when you needed them, but they were never live documents. They were never used as they were meant to, and I think we're reaping the effect essentially of what was sown over the last 15, 20 years of construction. And I think the big change really, and I read Dame Judith Hackitt report in full detail. The system that's needed for oversight and enforcement of that, it just wasn't there. So every step that's been taken now to improve and get us to where we are now, although it's been very painful, and it will continue to be for some time, is there for the benefit of ultimately what we're housing and asking people to live in. So yes, I think we're going to have a few more years of pain, but we will ultimately get out a better product at the end of our construction projects.
And Ben, it's probably worth just adding to that is that, and I think it's a key point that's been made by Brittany and Lauren as well, is that in a lot of cases, since Grenfell, when we've started taking cladding off these buildings, when we've started actually investigating some of these issues, what we're finding is that what was installed wasn't what was specified, so it wasn't compliant. So one of the key, this issue of traceability is absolutely key in terms of evidencing compliance between, at Gateway 3 as well. We might touch on that later on in the seminar, but I think that message is now starting to get through, that actually having that record of, not just what was specified and approved, but actually what was then installed as being correct. And this whole issue around, for years and years in industry, it's been acceptable to substitute materials. Equal and or approved was always the phrase that we used. The problem is, in many cases, it wasn't equal and it hadn't been approved. So I think that's something else that we learned from Grenfell, but also subsequent investigation into existing buildings as well.
I think it's also adding
That's
on
right,
that.
yes.
Sorry, Ben, I was just going to say, adding on that to the culture of questioning product data safety and manufacturers testing things is starting to trickle through. We always took things at face value, and the amount of times I've seen documentation where it's a screenshot of what's on a website of manufacturers' claims versus actually what the evidence was is interesting. Sorry, Ben.
Oh no, thank you, Lauren. I think the scale of the problem has been set out, and the role of traceability in solving and improving traceability in solving the problem is clearly important. But I suppose there's one immediate other question springs to mind, is that now that the issue has been identified as being important, to ensure that traceability is as near to 100% as it's possible to get, are there already identifiable signs of progress from the construction industry? Is there tangible evidence of improvement? Possibly a rather difficult question to answer for the panel, but I think it might be on in the minds of some of the audience at the moment. Brittany, perhaps you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think we're seeing. So I think what's worth calling out is that there needs to be change at every single level. So to Lauren's point, you know, the material manufacturers, it's not good enough just to say on the website, oh, it does this. There needs to be that clear evidence and the providing of those certifications. And so there is beginning to be this sort of greater call from the industry, so the construction teams, the designers, the developers, to say to the manufacturers, guys, if you don't provide this information, we're not going to buy your products. And one segment of the industry that's done this really well is data centers. So it's not related to high-rise buildings, but it's actually the data center industry has said, you've got a timeline. If you don't provide us with the evidence, particularly around the sustainability of your systems, then we will not be procuring from you. And that's really lit a fire under the backsides of the material suppliers, because they want to be selling into these industries and these sectors. So we're certainly starting to see that positive shift in the way that the industry is engaging with its material supply chain, and how it's actually setting higher expectations and demands on them. But as with all these things, there needs to be that grace period of time to allow them to get those systems in place, and ultimately to provide that data in an easy and effective way. So I think that's sort of starting to come at the front end. Then throughout sort of design and construction, we're certainly seeing lots of teams and organizations turning towards technology and systems to help with that traceability piece. I think we need to be realistic with ourselves that humans are not very good at paperwork. We don't enjoy it. We hate typing things into spreadsheets, and we are notoriously bad at doing it. So the error rate of humans inputting data can be up to sort of 40% on sort of individual errors, just because you're tired, you're not really paying attention. It's not a great way to do it. So technology is fantastic at that, particularly when you're automating processes, when you're automating data capture and generation, or when you're aggregating data from lots of different systems, for example, material suppliers. So there's a real uptick in our industry turning towards different technologies to help them collect, clean, aggregate, and then actually understand that data. The bit that I think we're missing as an industry, and that we're working on a lot at Qflow, but other people are working on too, is really closing that loop between design and construction. So you designed and specified and signed off this stuff. This is what actually happened in construction, and that's the hardest bit to capture, is what actually happened on the ground. But then also, how do those two things relate? And I think this is where the golden thread of data has become such a compelling piece for the industry, is you've got to close that loop and evidence that what happened is what you said was going to do. That's the bit that I think we're probably most nascent in as an industry as a whole, but we're making the right kind of moves to get there.
Ben, can I respond to that question in two parts, really? Because I think the honest answer is there isn't a lot of evidence that a lot has changed since Grenfell in this space at the moment. Now, part of the reason for that, I think, is because and this isn't the right answer, by the way, industry was waiting to be told, and that this is one of the issues, quite frankly, we've had more broadly around the Building Safety Act. For a long time, industry was waiting for legislation and then waiting for regulations to tell them what to do, rather than just getting on with it. And I think, you know, I've not seen personally a lot of evidence that you know, the dial has shifted significantly. A lot of conversation, a lot of good work being done, which we'll probably touch on in this, you know, with this panel, around putting the tools in place from a digital point of view to capture information. But if I broke this down into two parts, you know, the issue around product information, you know, clearly identified there was a lack of good information, lots of good marketing literature, but not necessarily good product information that could be relied upon. And I think that was one of the things. Now, there has been some good work done in that space, and I'd like to sort of shout out for the Code for Construction Product Information in that respect, which has been around for a while. I sit on something called the Industry Safety Steering Group that's chaired by Dame Judith Hackitt, and we were advocating CCPI, 2 or 3 years ago. The reality is, as their chief exec, Amanda Long will tell you, is the take-up hasn't been as great as one would have hoped, albeit that the whole purpose of CCPI is to ensure that there is information that's clear, that's accurate, accessible, up to date, and unambiguous, which absolutely goes back to the Building a Safer Future report, where it was clear that that wasn't the case, and we needed to change that. So, CCPI on the one side, I think is something, we need to see more product manufacturers signing up to and supporting. I think the other, coming back to the legislative space, we know that probably next year we're going to start seeing construction product regulations. There's provisions within the Building Safety Act to create regulations. We've had a construction product regulator within the OPSS now for a while. But we're still waiting to see what that legislation actually is going to look like, particularly around the testing regime. I mean, the public inquiry pretty much sort of cast a spotlight on the failings of the construction product testing regime. Again, for those who've been in the industry for a long time, we would never have questioned that. We just assumed if you work on a construction site where you're an architect or a specifier, that that product had been tested and you could rely on those test results. That's no longer the case, unfortunately, post Grenfell. So we had the review that Paul Morell and Annalise Day did, which has been around for a short while now. We know that's informing the government's thinking around changes, reform of the construction product testing regime as well. So I think we're in an interesting place in the sense that I think over the next year we're going to see a lot more clarity around what organizations, manufacturers, and others that are testing housing and such are going to need it to do in order to comply with the law. But until we get that, I think we're still, it's a very mixed picture, is my sense at the moment.
Mixed picture. Do you agree, Lauren?
I absolutely. I would never disagree with Paul. I think he knows he knows everything. Just from our perspective, and echoing again what Paul and Brittany have said, I think we are seeing some kind of uneven adoption across different product types as well. So for your high risk categories, your fire doors, your facade systems, I think that's moved faster and quicker as it should do. But there's a different playing field for your lower risk, your commoditized items, things that are more standardized. And that still lags, I think now. I think we're also seeing policy moving quicker now, I should say, rather than quickly, because I think quickly is not how I would describe the Building Safety Act. But it's moving quicker, but it's not keeping, I think, the where we need to start to focus on as well as around site level enforcement and monitoring of what's going on during the construction activities. Because I think that needs, as Brittany mentioned earlier, I think our looming disaster of Gateway 3, as I like to call it, is going to be a real challenge to the industry. And unless we're monitoring and checking and documenting everything that's carrying on the few sites that have managed to get a Gateway 2 approval, we are building up a real problem for the future.
Yeah, and I think the reality is for our industry is that we're unlikely to see that accelerated change until the pain is felt, and until we see more and more projects being told, no, you can't occupy this building, you've got to go back and redo X, Y, Z at cost. And so we're going to start feeling it in terms of pace of project completion and occupation, and then also the cost of buildings and the cost of that rework. That's when the industry, I think, will really sit up and pay attention, which is a real shame that I think it is going to have to go through that pain point first. But ultimately it's the bottom line that talks in construction. And I think, Paul, you made a really great point earlier before we jumped on the call, that this is likely to follow a similar trend as to how health and safety did in our industry. It was very slow culturally to get fully embedded, that the safety of teams is the #1 priority, and that we shouldn't be cutting corners where it puts people's health and well-being and lives at risk. I think we're probably going to see a similar thing where people kind of get the regulation, they start paying it a certain level of lip service, but actually embedding that level of quality control and that level of accountability and responsibility within team delivery processes is going to take longer. I would love it if our industry learnt from what we did at health and safety and did that so much quicker. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to learn and do better this time. But just having seen health and safety do it and sustainability do it, and now this quality element do it, and it's likely that we will see that lagging behind the sort of real pain of the bottom line impacts.
I think the trickle down effect is going to be very challenging here as well, because I think we'll see the tier ones and the larger organizations adopt this quicker, but going down the supply chain, smaller suppliers, smaller subcontractors, smaller installers, and having them build the infrastructure up to maintain full trace records on everything is going to be very challenging, and we'll be having this conversation, I think, quite a lot over the next few years.
There's a multifaceted approach required from industry, government, and regulators. If I can just turn it back, the conversation back specifically to materials traceability. I'd like to ask you, Lauren, what you think in terms of the tools, processes, and cultural shifts that can help ensure that firms are tracing materials from specification all the way through to installation, which I think is the goal, the end state that that is being looked for.
It's the utopia, I like to call it. That what we're always aiming for. I think just to turn that slightly on its head, a lot of the work we do involves projects that haven't passed gateway checkpoints and haven't passed validation points and are having problems kind of getting the evidence that they need. So we've seen the worst case scenarios where they do not hold the right information, and the culture hasn't been there to kind of reflect how deeply and intensively you need to look through data and testing to be able to pass through these gateways. So we can see the impacts on projects, the impacts on teams, the impacts on kind of the ultimate client essentially sitting and waiting for things to be built. So the hard points are there. Now there are a lot of digital tools available, and I think that's half of the challenges working through these different platforms and different CDEs that many of our teams use. But a lot of our clients don't hold those, especially if you're looking at a residential block that's been there for a lengthy period of time, and they won't have their own in-house common data environment that they can use. So we're having to kind of resource this and gather this information without the full kind of very all singing, all dancing platform that will tell you everything. So we see a real challenge both for clients and for the process really. But the culture shift is the biggest challenge. I think we have there's been a real culture shift already since the Building Safety Act came in place. And it's been very slow, and it's still moving in the right direction. But I don't think that's filtered down. We're still focusing on higher risk buildings and gateway processes rather than the nuts and bolts of what's needed to make sure that these are safe. And I think that's still going to take quite a long time to come through.
I see Paul's nodding his head. Would you like to add anything to that, Paul?
I would, Ben. Thank you. I mean, I think Lauren touches on a really important point about the culture change, and I think at the heart of that is this issue of competence, and I think that crosses the whole built environment and whole built environment process. And one of the things that we learned from the Grenfell inquiry and from the independent review was that there was a competence issue within the industry, and I think that applies to products as well. And I think Lauren very kindly said earlier that I know everything. That there is an awful lot that I don't know, and I think that that to me is definition of competence. I think it's a recognition that there's stuff and there's stuff you don't know, and the stuff you don't know, you shouldn't be trying to pretend that you do. You should be going out and taking advice on that. So I think what has improved significantly since Grenfell is there's a lot of guidance out there now. That doesn't necessarily mean people read that guidance or even if they understand it, but the one thing they should be doing is they should be, if they don't know the answer, they should be asking the questions. And I think we worked recently, I led a working group to produce guidance on products critical to safe construction. And that was very deliberately, and we did that with the Construction Products Association, CCPI, which I mentioned earlier, Institute of Structural Engineers, and the RIBA. And the objective there really was to try and put something out there that said, just try to inform people. So give people a better understanding of how, in context of products that are critical to safety, what they should be thinking, the questions they should be asking, if you're a designer or specifier and installer. And if you don't know, where can you go to find out more information? Now that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a green paper. There's a green paper that was published earlier this year, which sort of set out the government proposals around a new regulatory regime for products. But we won't know until next year when the legislation comes out how that's actually going to come into force. And I think that that underlines another key point here: is the state of the art is constantly changing. This is a complex area, and I think we have to recognise that complexity, but it's also changing all the time. So I think that it's incumbent on all of us in this industry to recognise that and be constantly asking ourselves, do we know enough? Do we, if we don't know, who do we go to ask about stuff like that? So I think this wider issue of competence is so key. I mean, it's hardwired into the legislation anyway. You have to demonstrate that you're competent, and that's any building, by the way. That's not just high risk buildings as defined under Building Safety Act. I think there's a really key piece here, and that very much then rolls into the construction product space as well.
Brittany, how do you draw the connection between traceability and competence?
I think the competence piece is a really interesting one, because so when I was studying as a civil engineer, there was, your core subject, there were things you had to know, and then you get launched into the world of the industry, and all of a sudden you realize it is so much bigger and more complex than what they teach you as the sort of core capabilities and core competencies at university. And I think what is being asked of design teams and project teams is increasingly complex, and we need to hold so much more information in our heads and be able to spot the sort of weird blips and nuances that make you want to ask a question. It's really that ability to identify where a question needs to be asked than knowing the specific answer. And that's really where the skill comes in engineering and in construction, is knowing when to question something and how to question it. I think where there's an opportunity for our industry is that as the sort of sheer volume of the content increases, and as Paul said, it's constantly changing as well. The standards of these materials and what they're able to do is constantly evolving. We shouldn't be expecting our teams to be able to memorize everything and be sort of an encyclopedia of material types and capabilities, but be able to work with our colleagues and also technology systems to help us find those answers and go deeper into where those questions are, with a massive cautionary tale and caveat that AI will not answer this for us. And I get really nervous when people are like, oh, we'll just chuck everything in AI and then we'll just ask it the questions and assume that what it tells us is right. My God, please do not do that. Like, LLMs are, large language models are incredible, and they do have some really fantastic sort of co-pilot capabilities working alongside humans to do this, but they should never, ever be taken as giving you the exact right answer, and you shouldn't be relying on them to answer your questions. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to increase our capabilities and our competencies and our access to information by leveraging technology and working alongside AI to say, hey, I'm trying to find this bit of information within the specs and within the design around this material. Can you pull it all up for me? So instead of us filtering through loads of information, you can get access to it very quickly, but it still relies on someone who is competent to be able to question the data that's being put in front of it, and then go and find the other people in that team who have that other slither of information. So we need to be better at asking questions and identifying anomalies, and we need to be better at working alongside technology to try and pull out the right information and analysing those data sets. But please, my lord, do not go and rely on LLMs to just answer these questions for you. So that's my one, like, please don't do that to the industry right now. The tech is not there yet, no matter what people tell you.
I think that's a warning you've been wanting to issue.
Yes, I think AI is amazing, and there's so much in the media about like, oh, it's going to transform the world. It absolutely will, but probably not in the sort of utopian way that people are expecting. We need to take it with a pinch of salt, particularly when people's lives are at risk. And we are talking about the safety of buildings here. And so we should not be just turning to it as some like crazy oracle. It's not that.
Lauren, what do you think? The human in the loop, I think, is the term the military use for this.
I'd agree. I think I always channel my inner health and safety practitioner when it comes to this, and question everything. And as everyone who works in safety will know, if it's not written down, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So the same way we would investigate any type of accident, when we look into looking at product traceability and data, show me the evidence. And when we've seen that, prove to me that that was done under the right circumstances, in the right environment, and with the right, accredited competent testers in the first place. So question everything is what I do. And I would echo Brittany's stance around AI. It is useful, massively useful, and it's very speeding things up. But we've always got to question where it's looking at data in the first place and where it's drawing its conclusions from, and it isn't there yet. But watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add on that there is a massive opportunity here for material manufacturers and suppliers and designers to actually stand out head and shoulders above the rest by providing that information and providing that evidence. So where you've got people like Lauren who are saying, show me the evidence, if you can provide that, they're way more likely to procure from you than someone else who's like, oh, I don't really have it, so it's going to take me 3 months to put it together. Like, if you want to win in this very tough environment, get your data right, get it in front of people in a way that is transparent, formatted, accessible, all of these key things.
Exactly. And then be honest and transparent about what's been tested and how and under what conditions, so that there's no awkward questions later on when something's been queried as well.
I think, Ben, the behavioural piece is so important. I mean, I'm glad, we've turned this to some extent also to conversation about people and individual behaviours. I mean, the definition, legislation of competency, skills, individual competence, skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours. So I do think as an industry, we need to look very hard, and you only have to go back to the shocking evidence at the phase 2 inquiry about what happened in the product space to realise that there was a culture in that industry that drove certain behaviours, and I think that's the hard edge to this. We've got to really, the technology is fantastic. It's going to make this a lot easier, having the right tools and everything. But ultimately, it'll come down to the human in the machine, as you rightly said, who is, who you're relying on to do the right things and behave in the right way. And the organisational, there's a whole other piece of work that's being done around organisational capability. The organisation needs to look at itself and say, have we got the right culture? Have we got the tools in place that allow people to make the right decisions, the right ethical decisions, do the right thing rather than just what they think they should be doing in order to hit a target, for example. I think this, one of the key lessons for me about Grenfell is that we've got to look under the surface with a lot of this stuff and say, how are we going to actually drive real change in the industry at an individual as well as organisational level?
Thank you, Paul. And by the way, thank you so much to the audience for submitting so many questions. We will try and get through as many as we can in the time available, and we will try to answer as many offline as possible as well. So on that note, I'd like to refer to a question from the audience. Perhaps I can pose this one to you, Lauren, first of all. Hope it's not a hospital pass, but here we go. As consultants, are you asking the supply chain for structured, in other words, machine readable data about construction products? If not, why not? And if so, what is the response that you're getting?
That's a good question. I like that. I'm going to give you a very vague consultancy answer here. It depends on the project and it depends on what we're doing. But in our typical project role that we work on, we are there because the client team or the project team or the design team does not have the in-house competency initially around certain key aspects of the Building Safety Act or certain key aspects of legislation. So we are there to ask those questions, and we should be asking those questions, absolutely. It does depend on where we're working and what we're working on as to the types of questions that we will ask. But I think we wouldn't be doing our job if we weren't writing what we should be doing in each of these scenarios. The types of responses we do get are varied. And I work with some great clients on some great projects, and we have a number of gateway approvals through which we were really put through the ringer on those as to giving the accountable kind of evidence and transparency all the way through to get to those positions. We know what good looks like, and we do know where that evidence just isn't there, and we've had to highlight that and pull that through. But our job is to make sure that everyone is collaborative, transparent and honest, and where we have gaps or weaknesses or lack of knowledge or lack of evidence, that's raised as early as possible. So yes, we do see that. We are seeing improvements as well. What we're looking at now versus what we looked at a year ago or even longer ago, they're leagues apart in terms of the quality of the evidence that's starting to come through now. It does take a lot of engagement with the supply chain all the way through as well. So we do start to see which of the suppliers, which of the manufacturers are doing things in the right way. So you do tend to steer different groups down there, knowing that it's going to be a smoother ride because the evidence and the documentation is there to support the journey of the project. But that pool of manufacturers and suppliers is broadening as well. So we are, I can see the green roots, as it were, to get us into the right direction.
Thank you, Laura.
Not to be too vague there, but
oh no, thank you. Thanks for the answer. And you mentioned the supply chain. That actually brings me on to another audience question, and maybe I can pose this one to Paul. Audience member asks, are we seeing the supply chain engage with the rest of the industry, the supply chain specifically, with regard to the digital golden thread requirements? Is that something you're noticing?
Not to the extent that I would have hoped for, and I think that comes back to the previous question. And Brittany might have a view on this as well, because she's much closer to this space from a technology point of view. I think there is a recognition that there's a lot more that needs to be done from the supply side of the industry. I'm not sure at the moment where the leadership for that is coming from, and I think that's one of the questions maybe that we need to look at more widely. I mean, it's interesting, I've seen a couple of questions in the chat about CCPI. To me, and I would say this obviously because we supported it from an industry safety steering group perspective, but CCPI is a no-brainer. So we need to look at why there are barriers to adopting that, and then there might be legitimate reasons why the industry isn't stepping up, but I've always sort of been very conscious since we started on this journey, and I remember having these conversations when I was on the Golden Thread working group with what was then the Department of Levelling Up, that what we don't want to do is create unintended barriers to entry. The supply side is complex. The whole ecosystem is a complex one. I mean, I remember in the early days when we were looking into this space, we had to think quite hard about the fact that, and we talk about this, by the way, in that guidance I mentioned earlier about, very often we're talking about an assembly of products that come together to form a system. A component that goes into a building, but very rarely are those systems are tested as a system. So again, there's that whole question around, well, how are we actually, when we're bringing these products together from all over the world, because this is a global sector, ensuring that as a system, they function as they're intended to, and that comes back to the testing regime. I had a call a couple of months ago from somebody who said, we've been presented with this challenge, which is there's no test of data available for this particular solution in an existing building. So the existing building space is a whole other conversation, but when you're retrofitting, getting that right, it brings a whole new set of challenges as well. And unfortunately, the answer was, well, it's a unique system. You're going to have to basically assemble it and get it tested to demonstrate compliance. Now, others might have a view on that on this call, but I think that's kind of where we're moving into now, as a space where it goes back to that question of asking questions. I was pleased at least they reached out and asked the question, because I think the sense from the building owner in that case was, well, we can just buy these things off the shelf, fit them into the space, and it's going to work. Well, no, you need to demonstrate that solution is actually going to achieve the function that it's designed to do, particularly if it's life safety critical.
So Brittany, in terms of what Paul's just mentioned, and also the supply chain engagement on golden thread requirements, what's your perspective?
I think your point, Paul, around the leadership is a really interesting one, because we've seen this in a different part of the industry. So some of you may have come across the iMasons Climate Accord, which was a call put out by all of the big data center builders, basically to say to the supply chain, if you are not able to provide this data to us within the next 3 to 5 years, we will not be buying from you. And so they basically pooled their buying power and consolidated their message so that it was clean and consistent, went out to the suppliers of data center component parts and said, if you can't give us your information around, in this case, it was around the embodied carbon of key components, then we won't be able to buy your systems. And I think that leadership has driven a shift in the way that the supply chain is thinking. And I think there was 3 things that they did really well there. One was they basically pulled that buying power, so they had greater leverage. 2, they gave a really clear requirement of those manufacturers, and it wasn't, need to go and get this certification. So it's not, there's a cost to you in this in terms of getting some third-party piece. It's you need to get your data in order, and here's guidance on what that data needs to look like. And then thirdly, they gave them a sensible time frame within which to do it. It wasn't, you need to provide it to us tomorrow, otherwise we're not going to work with you. It was, you've got 3 to 5 years to put this in place. If you can't show us that you are at least on the way to doing that, or that you have it within 5 years, then we won't be able to buy from you. And so I think that's the kind of leadership from the industry, from the top of the industry, that can really help give focus and give clarity to the supply chain as they engage in it. The other part of the question around sort of engagement in that digital golden thread of data piece, it is really hard for the lower parts of the supply chain, so your tier 2s, your subcontractors, to adopt some of these really big digital systems that either are particularly complex or are particularly expensive. We need to be realistic as an industry about how we're going to filter down the digital capabilities across that supply chain. There are some amazing supply chain systems that are coming bottom up, that are tailored specifically for subcontractors and tier 2s. So there's that piece of it. We are very much sort of top down, so we work with the GC, the general contractors or main contractors, and the developer themselves, but then they give free access to their subcontractors and suppliers to use the system. The other thing that we focused on is making it incredibly easy. And I think this is where a lot of technology falls over, and this is where BIM, I saw the B word come up in the Q&A, I wondered how long that would take, but this is where BIM has really struggled, is that it's complex, and therefore it's very time consuming, and in an industry that has quite high turnover of staff in the sort of tier 2s, it's very difficult to get people to use those systems. So I think anything that you're expecting your sort of broader supply chain to adopt needs to be, in the nicest way, idiot proof, like absolutely simple. And so when we thought about how we built out Qflow, we focused on, what's the level of tech literacy that we can expect of literally anyone on the street. So for us, the question was, can they take a selfie? If they can take a selfie, they can use Qflow, because literally all you've got to do is take a photograph. And what we figured out is that the guys on site that were using the system to capture data, most of them have been on the site since 16 and laying bricks and working their way up to foreman and so on, that most of them have grandkids who love to take photos with them. And so that was our kind of like, can we make it that simple to use? yes, then we can make sure that we get that kind of engagement adoption, and then incrementally we can work with them on those digital skills and that literacy. So it's got to be a slow and sensitive process. We've got to be compassionate to where the industry's at today. We have to meet them where they're at in terms of their tech skills and capabilities, and then work with them around building up those capabilities around using data. The guys who actually use the data from our system are in the head office, and they're in the site office, and they typically do have better data skills and are more engaged and interested in the data. So it's the appropriateness of the bits of technology for who's going to be using them will really help us engage the supply chain on this journey.
I think, Ben, if I could come back on that, I mean, first of all, I don't think Brittany's ever seen me take a selfie.
So just your left eye and a thumb.
It's never great. It's never great. You don't want to see my selfies. I think, though, it's a really important point. It is something I just wanted to highlight, which is, you know, we can produce information in terms of traceability about products. So we can demonstrate those products have been properly tested, that all information, we can make sure when we're specifying those products, they're the right product to be used in that particular situation. But we then move into the space of how do we ensure that that's then being installed correctly? How do we ensure that the installers have the information they need? You know, we've seen so many examples over the last 2 or 3 years of buildings being opened up and cavity barriers. Now, cavity barriers are not a complex bit of technology, let's be honest, you know, being installed upside down, the wrong way around, incorrectly installed, because people don't, obviously, either they don't understand the importance of doing it correctly, or they've not been properly trained, or they don't care. Combination potentially of all those three. But the consequence of that, as we know, is that sort of solution from a design point of view, very simple bit of technology, actually then won't perform the way it's intended in the event of a fire. That's pretty fundamental. So I think there's another point when we talk about product information. It's not just about the information about the product itself. It's the information that then needs to be passed on and the training that then needs to be in place to ensure that it's installed correctly. I attended a presentation last week from a fire stopping company, Qualis Flow, who many of you will be familiar with. And what really struck me about it was how clear their guidance was in terms of where you could, what products you used in what situations, how to install it. So it's all very clear, but then at the back end of the presentation, there's loads of examples of people just doing it wrong. So we've got a gap to bridge there. You know, the information itself, first of all, the information needs to be clear in terms of how do you install these products correctly, and then we need to ensure that people installing them are properly trained and they're competent to install. So this is you know, product information to me is broader than just that stuff that says, you know, this is the product, this is how it's been tested, this is where you can use it, and we got to look at that as well in terms of the life cycle of a project.
Thank you, Paul. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Sorry, Ben. Yes, I just want to say, the conference I was at last week, which was Advancing Construction Quality, there was a talk there that was just fantastic. And he started the talk all focused on Lego. And I think we can learn a lot from Lego in terms of how we communicate the putting together of systems in a way that is really simple to understand. So limited words, just diagrammatical workflows. And I think this is where technology can help, as you can be on site, you can call up those diagrammatical workflows and double check, say, right, I've done this 20 times, but I just want to check, have I followed all those steps? Have I installed it correctly? So I think there's an opportunity here for us to improve timely access to information to enable better quality control. And this is something that I think is starting to come through with the various different technologies that are looking at that sort of site level support. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Brittany. No, thank you. Just got time, I think, for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. There's so many have come in from the audience, I'm afraid. Apologies to the audience, we haven't had time to address them all. But I think one quite germane question is asking the panel what you think about the standardization of construction product data in terms of helping product traceability, standardizing the data. The questioner says at the moment, I see no 2 suppliers with very similar data or labeling structure. And how does that feed into the problems around traceability? Should the government provide more guidance on this to accelerate the possibility of traceability? Who wants to pick that one up first?
I can start on that one. So all we do is we capture, like every day in and out, we capture the material delivery information and the waste transfer information from construction sites. And it blows my mind how unstandardized this information is, to the point where you've got individual material manufacturers who are naming themselves 20, 30 different ways on their own delivery slips. So being able to analyze and audit this data is impossible without a level of cleaning and processing, which is ultimately what we do. So it makes it an absolutely colossal technological challenge to understand and analyze this data when it is unstandardized, and that's part of what we've solved for. But it would make the whole industry's lives better if, yes, we had a standard structure, we had a standard agreed lexicon for how we name products and how they link into the BIM model. So we currently map to Uniclass, but we're also mapping against other naming conventions because we still haven't agreed one as an industry on how we're going to name things. And it is a huge problem, and it's going to continue to frustrate and slow down progress in the area if we cannot agree a structure. That said, there have been countries that have tried to do this in the past. So Norway mandated the implementation of a barcoding system across their entire construction supply chain. They did mandate that. It got less than 5% adoption over 5 years, and they scrapped it because they just couldn't get the supply chain to adopt it consistently, and therefore they were not getting the level of information they need. So I don't think just mandating and hoping that that works will be sufficient, and we've seen it not be sufficient for other countries. But we do need to, as an industry, be working towards some kind of consistent expectations and format from people. And I think that's possibly where the iMasons Climate Accord has taken a slightly different approach of not mandating it from a government perspective, but as a buying perspective. They've pooled that collecting buying power and said, if you don't provide us this information, we're not going to be able to buy from you. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. But from what we've seen so far across the globe, that may be a slightly more effective little stick alongside some carrot for the supply chain to start actually completing and standardizing their data. But absolutely, it's needed. It's such a blocker that we are inconsistent with this.
Thank you, Brittany. Lauren.
I can add to that a little bit. I know I had a project a couple of weeks ago where we had an insulation board, material that was different naming convention, different product terminology, different formats, different interpretation of the same test standard. And if you had to look at them, you'd just assume they're exactly the same product. But trying to get it to fit into golden thread and to be documented, it's incredibly impossible to integrate it into common data environments as well. So that's been really challenging. But I've always viewed this as it's about culture. Again, this is about how we adapt to change, and it is about technology, but it's also about behavior. And it's from a manufacturer's perspective, it's looking at that data standardization as part of their product safety assurance, not just marketing. So not just a code that they should sign up for. It's part of the whole process and the change that's needed. So where we're able to, by working with certain clients or working with certain project teams, we specify certain types of mandated structured data formats where we can. But again, that limits your pool of who you can go to in terms of the manufacturing environment as well, and which suppliers you can use. But ultimately, that's going to help us get through Gateway 3 when we eventually get there on projects as well.
Thank you, Lauren. A quick thought from you, Paul, on this question of standardization.
Oh, it's a very quick thought. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? I don't think I can add anything to what Brittany and Lauren says. I mean, if we can get to a place where, again, it comes back to what the independent reviews said about the problem being, the regime is opaque and the information that exists around that regime is opaque. So anything we can do to, reduce that opaqueness and create more consistency, to me is going to make this process, and for those who actually have to use this information, it's going to make it a lot more straightforward and therefore a lot more reliable.
We've got about 7 minutes left. I think we'll just squeeze in one more question if we may. Also from the audience, thank you again for your engagement. Somebody asked actually a question about senior level people in organisations. Does the panel think that a lack of digital skills, knowledge and awareness at senior level is causing some organisations to make poor decisions about technology and is making the overall issue more complicated. Lauren, Pat, I don't know if you've got an opinion on that.
I think we can probably pose that question across many different workflows and many different scenarios. And with the onset of AI and the kind of digital adaptation of everything, I think this is a real challenge. If you're not technically able and capable and digitally tooled up as quickly as you can possibly be, you'll find yourself left behind. So it is, I always find, unless you're in the detail, unless you're doing the work and doing the projects and understanding the day-to-day challenges of summarizing and getting this information into the format that it needs to be in, you won't see the problem for what it actually is. And sometimes when you're in a more senior position, when you're looking at a bigger picture, not necessarily the detail and the day-to-day challenge of this poses, you might miss that. So yes, I think it is. I do know that things are moving in the right direction, because ultimately these minor details end up becoming bigger issues, which ultimately end up impacting on program and cost and delivery and being able to operate some of these buildings as well. So that's when it becomes high on the radar for more senior leadership as well to take note of, but it shouldn't get to that point. So hopefully, yes, I see it as a big issue. It is impacting projects, and I think encouraging senior leadership to get involved in the day-to-day detail to get them to understand this, I think will be a significant improvement.
Thank you, Lauren. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I think it'll be nice to go around the group and just ask you all for your final thoughts on this particular issue for the audience to take away with them. Brittany.
I mean, it's been a great conversation, so thanks so much to everyone on the panel as well. I think the headline is that there's, part of this is about the technical process of getting hold of the information and getting it from the supply chain, and we have a specific technical issue there, but the bigger piece is actually cultural, and it's how we as an industry can kind of come together and engage in it and also share that accountability and responsibility. One of the things I loved about the Hackitt review, and actually we've seen it from other bits of the industry as well, so I mean, we engage a lot in waste regulation and we see it in waste regulation, is that it's not just that single point that is, installing the material or buying the material that's responsible. It goes all the way up the chain. Everyone is responsible and accountable for making sure that it's the right stuff at the right time. And so you can't be quite as slopey shouldered as we previously could be on some of these topics. And I think getting that embedded in our minds, that we are all responsible for each other's safety. On the health and safety front, you're responsible for your colleagues and your peers' safety on site as well as your own. When we're talking about fire safety in buildings, you are responsible for the safety of those people who inhabit it later, and that's on you as well. So having that personal sense of accountability and responsibility in the process is a big cultural shift for the industry, but it's a really important one, and one that will take time, but one that we definitely can get to.
Thank you. Lauren.
I think what I wanted to emphasize today, and I know we've talked around it, Building Safety Act is not just your tall buildings, it's every construction project, and the culture and the change, although it is moving in the right direction, particularly for non-HRBs, is slow. And we are trying to engage as much with the industry as we can, but I think unless everyone starts to step up, take accountability, to transfer the skills and knowledge from HRBs and gateway processes and Golden Thread to the wider construction sector as a whole, and embed that learning and the right behaviours, as Brittany and Paul have mentioned earlier, the right behaviours into what we do on the day-to-day, we will see this dragging out for a very, very long time. But I feel like we're moving in the right direction. But I think we could all encourage it to move along a little bit quicker.
Thank you, Lauren. And a quick final thought from you, Paul.
Yeah, I think at the heart of all this, Ben, is the responsibility that we all have, all of us involved in designing, creating, owning, operating buildings for those who use those buildings, whether they're residents or whether they're going there to learn, or whether they're going into buildings to work, or to heal. That doesn't change. So I think that is, for me, is the key message.
I think that's all we have time for. So thanks again to Brittany, Paul, and Lauren for an engaging discussion. And thanks also to the audience. I hope you found this webinar interesting. Goodbye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.